On 26 September, a series of explosions ruptured the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines which run gas between Russia and Germany. As the tons of methane that were pressurising the pipes finished bubbling out into the atmosphere, the circumstances surrounding the explosions remain unknown. For various reasons that we'll look at later, the damage is broadly considered by the world's leaders and experts to be an intentional act of sabotage, probably committed by a state actor. But while we wait for information to point us to answers that may never arise, I think it's important to take a second look at the explosion's consequences, the possible culprits, and how various parties stand to gain or lose in the fallout. Unsurprisingly, this is already falling off the news cycle. But the move to sever the gas connection between Russia and Europe while triggering an environmental disaster is an enormous game changer that has the potential to significantly escalate the existing conflict and reshape the world order. Nord Stream 1 and 2 are massive pipelines built to supply Germany and the European Union with gas from Russia. As you probably know, Russia is an enormous exporter of gas. In fact, it's the biggest supplier in the world. And their number one customer is the European Union. Germany is the economic powerhouse of Europe, with an industrial model that's been largely built off the back of cheap Russian energy. This dependence on Russian gas has come into spotlight following the most recent Russian invasion of Ukraine in February this year, when the first response of Germany was to shut off Nord Stream 2, an $11 billion project which was only freshly completed and yet to be certified. At the time, Germany was getting 50% of its gas from Russia, and this pipeline was designed to double that flow. The timing of the second pipeline's completion and the invasion itself is likely intentional. There's ample evidence that Vladimir Putin had planned some form of this invasion for years, if not decades, and the Nord Stream pipelines are a prime piece of geopolitical leverage for the Russians to keep the West divided. A theme consistent with much of Russian strategy, such as their funding of far-right and far-left movements within European states. The success of this leverage is already evidenced in European Union members Bulgaria, Croatia, Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary exempting themselves from much of the bloc's recent oil sanctions against Russia. And it's no coincidence that these states, 3 of which are landlocked, are the most economically dependent upon Russia for their oil and their energy security. And for those states further down the dependency ladder, we're already seeing public protests against the heightened energy costs brought about by the sanctions. The pressure's real, and as winter approaches and energy prices continue to rise, it's safe to assume that these protests will expand and intensify, and there's no knowing how far the consequences of social unrest may go.
The right wing in Sweden has unfortunately taken the lead in Sweden's national election.
Giorgia Meloni to become Italy's first female prime minister and its first far-right leader since Benito Mussolini.
This is a soft win for the Russians, given these politicians vocally support prioritising national interests, such as lowering the cost of energy, over the concerns of the international organisations of which they're members, such as the NATO requests for military equipment or the EU sanctioning against Russia. Again, the extent of the consequences of these political shifts are yet to play out, but are potentially very significant. Isn't Nord Stream just a small part of this? Well, obviously not to someone who's taken on considerable risk in secretly committing a significant act of terrorism and an environmental destruction to take this strategic piece off the board. The Nord Stream pipelines are in fact the critical foundation of the equation that Putin's invasion is predicated on. The bet that the economic interdependencies between Europe and Russia will temper the Western response to Russian aggression to below a threshold that is bearable by Russia. It's not an unusual assumption and represents a type of thinking popularly characterised by New York Times journalist Thomas Friedman, who made the pithy observation that no 2 countries with a McDonald's have ever gone to war with each other, which, like most catchy observations, happens to be the exact opposite of true. And unfortunately for Putin, it looks to have been a bad bet, given the rare galvanisation of the global West that we've seen, with extraordinarily strong sanctions issued against Russia, despite the deep economic costs and energy insecurity that they inflict upon European countries, and a vast trove of military, intelligence and financial support all flowing from the West to defending Ukrainians. But with a relative stalemate grinding out on the front lines, and the consequent chaos ringing slowly through the global economy, the future remains uncertain, and winter is coming. So, what happened? Well, first we have to eradicate the possibility that was in fact just an accident. It's worth asking the question, because despite our best intentions, things do sometimes just fall apart with disastrous consequences. But pipelines such as Nord Stream are sturdily engineered projects that rarely simply malfunction like this, and given that the destruction of the pipes occurred at multiple points, it appears vanishingly unlikely. Adding to the mix the observation of the Swedish authorities that seismic activity consistent with explosions occurred simultaneously, and even without surveying the site, I think it's safe to join the various world leaders in concluding with certainty that this was an intentional act of sabotage. So then the obvious question is, who did it? The pipeline itself is between 70 and 110 metres below sea level, which is tantalising information to consider, as it means that theoretically it's in striking range of anyone who could rent a boat, some diving gear and dynamite. But some players are more likely than others. The first response of much of the world was an immediate, Russia did it. After all, they seem to be so intent on exploding things lately. What's another pipeline or two? Russia has significant underwater capabilities, with a large submarine fleet in the Baltic Sea, and have proven consistently to be a bad faith international actor, not only invading Ukraine, but puppeteering mercenary armies in Africa and the Middle East, while brazenly conducting assassinations on foreign soil. But the key question for Russia is why? Why blow up a tap that's the source of their leverage over Europe? A tap that they can simply turn off at their leisure? There is the case that exploded energy infrastructure demonstrates fragility of energy and drives up the cost, also sending the message that infrastructure targets are in play. But that doesn't seem particularly compelling to me. After all, they could just as easily blow up the Baltic pipeline between Norway and Poland to the same effect. Senior US officials have insinuated that Russia's to blame for the sabotage, which brings us to the next candidate. When I suggested to a friend that the US could be behind the attack, they were in disbelief. Surely the good guys don't do such things. But supposing the good guy morality isn't a universal truth for a moment, there's certainly a lot to be said for the US capacity to destroy Nord Stream. They control the most powerful navy, army, and air force by a considerable margin, paired with the best intelligence capabilities, and a history and culture of executing operations far beyond any other nation. Surely America could have done it easily. But why? Well, the United States is significantly invested in Ukraine's defense against Russia, to the extent that Putin overtly describes the current war as one between Russia and NATO, a de facto US-led alliance. It would be a big strategic win for the US if Russia were drained to the point of never again being able to threaten expansion in their region. Some 50% of the foreign arms provided to Ukraine comes from the US, who are also offering intelligence support and have trained thousands of officers in the Ukrainian army. The US has a long history of advancing Western interests in Ukraine, which has meant combating Russian interests, surreptitiously through the Orange Revolution of 2007, and then more visibly through the Maidan protests in 2014, which grew into the civil unrest that culminated in the ousting of pro-Russian President Yanukovych and subsequent Russian occupation of Crimea. But as with all other NATO nations who are enthusiastically supporting Ukraine, their commitment stops short of publicly committing to putting any boots on the ground. While Ukrainian forces have performed much better than expected, and the Russians have performed much worse than expected, the outcome of the conflict still remains anything but clear. As such, the continued pressure of the US-led West against Russia is dependent upon the West remaining united in its commitment to sanction Russia and send military equipment to Ukraine. A unity that's certain to come under increasing threat of unravelling as the economic costs of sanctions kick in. A critical economic artery between Russia and Germany, the Nord Stream pipelines, is a clear threat to that. But don't take my word for it.
If Russia invades, there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
Schönen Dank für Ihre Frage.
And this was the immediate reaction of the delighted former Polish defense minister, Radoslaw Sikorski. What's more, while taking Nord Stream out of commission locks in energy pain for Europe, it also benefits big exporters of replacement energy products, who get access to a new market in an environment where prices are at historic highs. Most of this opportunity will fall to oil and liquid natural gas, with the US in the top 5 global exporters for both. As such, the Russians are already publicly stating that this sabotage was conducted by the Anglo-Saxons, which is a catch-all term they're using for Britain and America. The incentives to lie in this arena are significant, and anything that anyone says should be taken with a kilo of salt. That said, here's a flight radar of a US military helicopter just 7 kilometers from the site of the explosions on the day that they happened. Ukraine's incentive for this are obvious. They're at war with Russia and need continued support from Western powers. As Germany's economy continues to slide and winter bites, there can only be an increasing temptation for Germany to push for a negotiated peace and thereby welcome Russian gas back into the fold. The Ukrainians also appear to be willing to engage in terrorist tactics, with even their close ally in this conflict, the USA, considering the Ukrainian state to be behind the recent assassination of Daria Dugina. But due to various capability limitations, not least being no access to the Baltic Sea, I've lumped them in as a potential saboteur along with Poland. Poland has shown deep solidarity with the Ukrainians, sending them weapons and aid, agitating within the EU for further sanctions against Russia, and this week even asking to host American nuclear weapons. Poland also has a deep stake in Russia losing this conflict, given their long and unhappy recent history of being totally occupied by their eastern power. Poland suffers greatly historically from its geographic vulnerability, surrounded by greater powers and having very few natural defensive barriers, and should Ukraine fall, they're geographically next in line. Another intriguing factor here is that a years-long project to construct a pipeline linking Norwegian gas fields with Poland, called the Baltic Pipe, went online the day after the sabotage occurred. It could just be a coincidence, but it's only the third major gas line running onto the Baltic, the other two being Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. Was Sikorsky's tweet thanking the US a cover-up, or just a mistake? Either way, he deleted it shortly after posting. There's a real chance that some combination of Ukraine and Poland were involved in this strike. If Russia isn't behind these attacks, don't expect Russia to casually accept the clandestine destruction of their infrastructure either. As such, this could make the risk of a reprisal attack on the Baltic Pipe extremely high, and very difficult to secure against. This throws another portion of chaos into the mix, threatening energy security, economic recession, and further military escalation. It's still possible this wasn't a state actor at all, but the work of terrorists. After all, it is an act of terrorism, however you slice it. And it's certainly not technically beyond non-state actors. In theory, it could even have been pulled off by some particularly industrious, disgruntled teens, although their trail would be much easier to follow and they likely would have been identified by now. Europe yet again sweated through its hottest summer on record, so we can understand that prospective eco-terrorists might have more than enough incentive to destroy such large fossil fuel infrastructure. But given the environmental fallout from the eye-watering quantity of methane emissions, it seems a stretch too far to me. It could be an act of corporate espionage for companies to secure market supply and increase their profits. But given that fossil fuel companies are currently raking it in anyway, that seems pretty implausible, particularly given the terminal consequences that would be faced for getting caught. Of course, the cases I'm making are based upon publicly available information, and it's perfectly plausible, if not likely, that intelligence agencies around the world would be able to construct a very different understanding of the event, with even minor pieces of additional information, such as, perhaps, secret negotiations between Russia and Germany to restart the gas flows. If the Nord Stream pipes are permanently offline, it will amount to a crossing of the Rubicon with no going back. Whether the Europeans wanted it or not, they're now divorced from Russian gas, and maybe for a long time. As the trapped methane slowly stops fizzing out of the Baltic, the investigations will begin. What they can hope to find from the site itself by way of clues, I would have thought would be limited to confirming that it was an explosion and determining how long it will take to repair. But who knows what they might come up with? It'll be people far smarter than me examining the site after all. The Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines are critical pieces of infrastructure for both the German and Russian states, and impact the European gas market and subsequent cost of living and doing business. The early analysis seems to range from they might be damaged beyond repair to one is reparable to both can be fine but it will take time. In short, there's still much to play out. The pipeline systems themselves cost over 20 billion euros to install, staked by a mix of public and private interests, notably Russian state energy giant Gazprom, some of the world's largest banks, and Europe's largest corporations. Even if they can be fixed, it's a hefty act of vandalism. If they can't, the loss of the construction cost is the equivalent of sinking 2 Nimitz-class aircraft carriers. It's also an ecological catastrophe, with the uncontrolled release of up to 500,000 tonnes of methane, a greenhouse gas with some 25 times the potency of carbon. Taking everything else out of the equation, the thought that someone's intentionally triggered what may be the single largest methane emissions event as a mere externality is another harrowing reminder of the supremacy of realist power games. If anyone is publicly and irrefutably proven to have conducted the attacks, it could trigger a reshaping of the geopolitical landscape. If it's found to be a Western state or group of states acting independently of NATO, they've committed a significant act of sabotage against their ally Germany, which would badly damage trust within the alliance structure, potentially undermining the organisation and even bringing pressure on the legitimacy of the 21 American bases on German soil. Not only that, but they will have escalated the conflict by directly conducting military action against a key asset of Russia, with whom they may not be formally at war with. This would risk reprisal actions and, more alarmingly, an escalation of the conflict into direct war between Russia and NATO, something that has to be avoided at all costs. If it is found to be Russia, or some proxy acting in their interests, it would mark an escalation of the scope of the current conflict and could potentially trigger Article 5 of NATO, whereby an attack on one member, in this case Germany, is considered an attack on all. This may force Russia and Ukraine to the negotiating table for a slapdash ceasefire very quickly, as the risk of all-out war between nuclear powers becomes unacceptably high. But hoping for such rationality hasn't done the best job of preventing destructive wars between major powers to date. If Russia is found to have destroyed the pipes as a demonstration of their control over European gas, or to tilt the market in any way, expect their energy resources to be sanctioned into oblivion, potentially triggering the end of the Russian regime or even state. The fallout stands at the nexus of interests for so many parties, and should the attack be linked back to any state actor, it's hard to see anything other than significant consequences and an unpredictable reshaping of both the conflict and the international world order. I should add that the possible exception here would be if it is Ukraine itself that's responsible, given that they're currently a party to the war, already understood not to be the most scrupulous actor, and on balance will probably be universally forgiven by third parties for not wanting Russia and Germany to trade energy at the moment. The consequence would likely be limited to a souring of relations with Germany, who are far from their most significant backers as it is. If it is found to be a non-state actor, such as a corporation or terrorist group bolstering some unseen interests, the international backlash would surely see them dissolved and prosecuted out of existence. In the meantime, the certainties of the situation are bad enough. It's certain that energy markets will be less efficient and more expensive. European productivity will decline and the cost of living will escalate. There will be accompanying social unrest with unpredictable consequences, all while the more stable energy exporters, in particular the US, Qatar, Norway, and my native Australia, will make money hand over fist as the Europeans and Russians spend more money and lives on yet another conflict which should never have begun in the first place. What do you think? I'm keen to hear who you think may be behind this and if there's anything major that I've missed. In the meantime, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. This channel is only possible thanks to the support of my patrons. I have plenty more I'd like to make across a big range of issues, so if you enjoy my work, please do consider signing up. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.